Dr. James Tanner is a specialist in Aboriginal land use, legal issues, economic evaluation, and anthropology. He's authored several traditional land use and environmental assessment studies and a novel based on actual historical events called Tar and Feathers, Tragedy in the Oil Sands. Here is our conversation with him about his career and hopes for the future. Dr. James Newland Tanner.
That's me.
Let's begin with some background about yourself, how you began working with Aboriginal peoples in Canada.
Wow, that's an interesting story. I was looking for some consulting work and went up to the university and met a fellow up there, and he was talking to me. I was saying to him, do you have any work in the environmental field? Because I'd been working in the oil and gas and I figured I could do something in environment. He says, no, but he asked me, he says, have you ever done any anthropological economics? Because he knew I was an economist. And I went, well, no, not really. Well, I took some courses at college, in anthropological economics. He said, great, that's perfect. He says, come up to Fort McMurray with me. I went, okay. So we went up to Fort McMurray, and I was asked to do an assessment of the losses due to oil sands development on the Aboriginal people around the Fort McMurray area. And that's basically how I got originally involved. It was quite something.
Now that's how you got started, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your earlier years, growing up in Alberta, your experience in the oil and gas business there, education, things that led up to where you are now.
Well, I started off, my first real job was actually managing a health food store and a food co-op. And this was during when I was going to the University of Alberta and taking a few courses in political science and economics. And after I finished a couple of years as manager of a restaurant and a health food store, I thought I'd maybe go back and finish my degree. So I finished my degree in economics at the University of Alberta. Then I did some graduate work in economics. So I was working for my dad in the oil and gas, in his oil and gas company, and doing some accounting for oil and gas and doing some accounting for his other clients, because he was a chartered accountant. And I got involved in the oil and gas business that way. And then things started to slow down in around 1980, 81, and there was a job coming up from the government on the Alberta Petroleum's Incentive Program. I got the job with the Alberta government as an economic forecaster for oil and gas activity, which was kind of nice because I learned a lot about how the government worked, and I had to study the oil and gas industry from an economics viewpoint. And then I moved on and I worked as an economics consultant, and I did energy consulting beyond that. And then I got involved in the oil and gas business. Me and another guy started an oil and gas company. We drilled oil and gas wells in northern Alberta and in Saskatchewan, different places, produced oil and gas. And we sold that company to Gulf in about 1996, I guess. And so I then came back to Calgary after we sold the company, and I was sort of looking around for some other thing to do, and that's when I got involved in the Aboriginal business. In the meantime, of course, I took my economics degrees, and I took a year off or a year and a half off and went to MIT, and there I studied resource economics and business management, as well as strategic planning for business. And I took international resource law at Harvard.
Very good. Now, we know that there has been and continues to be friction between the Aboriginal people, the oil and gas sector, and government. Now, given your background and experience in the oil and gas business, as well as being on the government side as an economic forecaster, what would you say is missing in those relationships and those negotiations between Aboriginal peoples, the oil and gas sector, and government?
Well, when I was first involved, I was very impressed that someone was asking me what was the effect of oil and gas development, specifically oil sands mine development, on Aboriginal activity. Aboriginal hunting, fishing, trapping, and just their cultural lives. Very impressed that somebody was actually asking the question, and also impressed that they were going to pay some economist to assess how much the natives were losing in terms of some kind of financial capacity. And so I went up there and I started to learn a little bit about Native people at the time. And I discovered that there was a whole different world that I knew nothing about. And part of the fact that I knew nothing about them was not unusual. And the Supreme Court of Canada knows and knew very early on in Aboriginal legal decisions that they made that generally the people of Canada don't know that much about Aboriginal people. So they said that the governments have to consult with Aboriginal people. Now, consultation, in the sense that the Supreme Court was talking about, is different than just regular, public meetings and talking to people. Consultation means discovering what Aboriginal people do. How do they exercise their rights? How do they hunt? How do they fish? What are their cultural habits? And is the economic development or the oil sands or the whatever development is occurring, is that affecting their rights? Is it affecting their ability to hunt, trap, or fish? That is what consultation is. So it's not just phoning them up and say, hey, we're going to build a plant, what do you think? It's going out into the field and finding out what they do and discovering whether or not you're really infringing on their rights. So consultation is a huge thing, and the government is required by the Supreme Court to defend First Nations and defend their rights and consult with them if there's going to be infringement. The problem that has unfolded over the last 20 to 30 years is the governments haven't been adequately performing that task. So regularly in the news you hear about First Nations challenging the government or taking the government to court and saying that a particular project may not go ahead because there was inadequate consultation. And the reason is that the government didn't fulfill its role and go out and help the company figure out whether there was an infringement. The natives got upset, took them to court, and the court agreed insufficient consultation. So it's a big issue.
So there is a big fundamental problem here, and it's getting worse. Is that right?
Well, the Aboriginal people have a ongoing historical deficit of consultation. The Supreme Court only started to design all these activities after the Aboriginal rights were included in the Constitution in 1982. And so all the activities up until then generally were not properly consulted. They didn't properly consult them. So there's all kinds of things that have been happening over the last 100 years or so that Aboriginal people have been sort of behind the 8 ball on. And now, with this new constitutional regime, we have an opportunity to maybe correct some of the wrongs that have been done over time. But the consultation process, it requires that you do some sort of a traditional land use study or some sort of a historical study of what the effects of industrial development have been on Aboriginal people. And this has to be done in order to assess whether the next level of industrial development has any effect. So this really gives us an opportunity. Now, if you diminish their ability to do traditional land use study, if you diminish their ability to be consulted, things get worse. They're going to get even worse if you diminish them. But now we have a new government. We have a new Liberal government that is speaking differently, seems to have a different attitude about the government's relationship with Aboriginal people. And hopefully that government is going to recognize the deficit in the consultation process and move to correct it.
Now, with all of that going on between big oil and gas, government, and Aboriginal peoples, where do you fit in the milieu of negotiation and compensation and all of the other issues that may come up?
Well, when I was first up there in Fort McMurray, in the Fort McMurray area, I discovered again that I did not know anything about Aboriginal people. I have great education in economics and in business and in assessments and appraisals and maybe assessment of the value of an asset or something like that. But I didn't know what and the economic choices were of Aboriginal people. Since economics is based on a series of choices, do I want that product or do I want this product? And the whole process, of course, of choice is one of the mechanisms where you assess that choice process to determine economic efficiency and all kinds of things like that. So I didn't know why or how Aboriginal people made choices or what they chose between. So I didn't know enough about their culture or their attitudes or what they did in their traditional land use to be able to assess what they were doing. So I had to sort of learn about it, and the way I learned about it was I sort of followed elders around. We went out in the bush and you know, they showed me where they went to hunt and how they hunted and how long they spent hunting and what they did when they got up in the morning and how they cut the meat up and where they picked berries and all that kind of stuff. And then I had to take that information and transform it into some sort of an assessment of their losses. And the only way to do that was to conduct a pretty sophisticated, pretty detailed, what they call a traditional land use study, which is a study of the way that a particular culture uses the land and how they hunt, fish, trap, gather berries, and exercise their cultural and their language rights. So you do this traditional land use study, which is the first step and a very important step in consultation. So I started to do the traditional land use studies, which is absolutely needed before you can assess any kind of loss or any kind of fulfilling of consultation process as required by the Supreme Court. So my company started to do traditional land use studies, and we have done, I can't even count them anymore really, something, well, maybe around 20 different traditional land use studies in BC, Alberta, a lot in Alberta, northern Alberta. We've done some in the Northwest Territories. We work for the Nunavut government. We worked for several in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, a couple in Ontario. Done quite a lot of traditional land use studies.
So that's where you fit now in the overall scheme of things then?
Well, once the traditional land use studies are done, then we do assessments of losses due to a particular, say it's a oil sands plant or a pipeline or sometimes it's a spill. Say there was an oil spill in Lake Wabamun, or there's a damming of the BC Hydro damming the Peace River, which was one of the projects that we had. Or maybe some more recent projects like building pipelines across Canada, or a new dam, Site C dam in BC. We could do an assessment of the effects of that dam on Aboriginal rights. And then there's a negotiation process that follows. The negotiation process that involves either mitigation or compensation, or in some cases maybe the project has to be changed or even stopped.
What needs to change, and what needs to change first?
In the whole process, more consultation, more consideration of Aboriginal rights. Up until very recently, Aboriginal rights have been ignored. Even worse, they've been violated, and like, for example, the typical example that went to the Supreme Court so many times in the very beginning was people supposedly hunting out of season. Well, Aboriginal people would hunt ducks in the springtime, not in the fall so much. In certain areas, they would hunt in the spring. Well, there was no hunting season in the spring. It was they would hunt ducks when they came back, and they would be charged with hunting out of season. And the officer would say, "Oh, what do you mean, Aboriginal rights?" I didn't understand, but they did. They had Aboriginal rights to do that, and they needed to do that because that's what they ate. They didn't go to the grocery store. They ate the ducks that they killed in the springtime. And so the whole situation was Aboriginal rights have been ignored, and we have to change that.
So it's not the case that Aboriginal peoples are being obstinate and difficult to deal with then?
Given the degree to which they have been ignored, I can't imagine characterizing their attitudes as being obstinate or difficult. Personally, I would have been much more obstinate and much more difficult, perhaps, than the Aboriginal people in Canada have been. They've actually been quite polite.
Now, you have coined the term practicalist economic policy, and it's become central to your thinking and your approach. Tell us what that means.
Well, practicalist economic policies are very, very practical, just like the word says. They are non-ideological. So you've got practicalist and you've got dogmatic, or you've got practical and you've got ideological. So if you were a socialist, for example, all your economic solutions would be something to do with socialism. It would have to conform to your socialist ideology. If you were a capitalist, everything has to be dogmatically capitalist. So pragmatism is a similar kind of an attitude. If you're a pragmatist, you could be a very good practicalist. But practicalism is really as it would be applied to economics. So you're looking for reasonable, everyday solutions to economics, and not limited by dogma, not limited by ideology. And that's basically what it is. So an example is the Keynesian revolution. Another example is the Chinese moving from their communism to a market system. They now have a system where they're using markets and they're using private enterprise and combining that with authoritarian planning system. It's just another form of a mixed economy. The cooperative system that was developed first in England and then in North America with cooperative farming groups. That's another example of a mixture of ideologies, democracy, economics, and market system. So we have that system. Micro finance, which is another combination of systems, cooperation and financial funding of small, tiny little business enterprises in developing countries. There's so many different applications, but these are all examples of people using common sense, using their ideas to, without any dogma, without any ideology, setting up a system that works, a system that solves an economic problem. And that's what practicalist economics is. And it's really not a new concept. The reason that I'm introducing it as a concept is because most economic thinkers, most people that are trying to solve economic problems, maybe you're a alderman in a city council, maybe you're a engineer or an accountant or an architect, or whoever you are in your life, you're making decisions that are affecting people's lives, and you want to come up with solutions that don't have to be, I'm saying to them, they don't have to be ideological. You don't have to just consider the market or just consider somebody, particular person's interest. You can find a solution that is practical, that is practicalist, that solves an economic problem without using ideology. So you can follow in the footsteps of Keynes and all the other really innovative and famous economists who've been able to do that kind of thing.
Where does this view come from?
Well, a lot of people might say that this is a very sort of weak idea, but it's not really. It's actually a very, very strong idea and needs to become a more prevalent part of everybody's ideas. For example, when the government is trying to assess the public interest, a lot of the systems that have been set up to make the government function are based on ideology. There's plenty of examples of this. One of them is that when we disseminate resources, when we make our resources available for private enterprise to exploit our resources, we set up certain systems, and those systems within the government are based on a private enterprise, a capitalist model. This is an ideological model. When we set up a new system, it has to be based on what I view to be the public interest from a practical sense. So we get rid of the ideology, the private enterprise ideology, without getting rid of the fact that we know that there's a lot of really innovative people in the economy, and we would like to do business with them, and we would like them to help the public interest, like we would like everybody to help the public interest. But we're only going to take away the ideological part of that, and no longer are we going to have to do things in an ideological way. So we're going to take a look at the public interest from a practical viewpoint. That means that if it's in the interest of the public for the government to have such and such regulation, or for the government to control a certain part of it, we're not going to shy away from it because it's not kowtowing to private enterprise. So, for example, we need to have a public interest process for oil and gas royalties, for dissemination of oil and gas properties, for environmental regulation, for all of the things that go into structuring a good, solid disposition and exploitation of oil and natural gas resources in the public interest. So that means that we're not going to give up the public interest because of some ideology. And that's how those two things work together. And that's why it's so important that we talk about this practicalism instead of ideology, instead of dogma. So we want economists in the future to think of themselves as being professionals, professionally capable of using economic tools, of which there are many, to practically make decisions about the public interest and make those recommendations to the politicians in a rational way that really supports the public interest and not a particular ideological group.
All right, now we've talked about your relationship with Aboriginal peoples, with the importance of the public interest, ideology versus practicality. How would you like to sum things up for us today?
Well, when I really started to get involved working with Aboriginal people, one of the reasons that I was inspired was because I knew that there was a lot of problems in that field, in that area, that there might be a really good place for somebody like me to work, and maybe I could help provide some solutions. Of course, I found out that it was a lot more difficult and the problems were much bigger than what I could solve. But I found that I can have some contribution, I can work towards some really positive things. I've found in the Aboriginal world that the dogmas and the racism and the misconceptions are huge. And it's more and more an issue of overcoming the problems, the mental problems, the racism, the dogmas, and the misunderstandings that we have about each other. Our problems are much more based on that than they are on good ideas. And that immediately led me to have a different view, I think, about economics in general, and how we deal with just resource disposition, how we deal with any of the ways that our government runs. I believe that we should be changing our whole government structure to be more innovative, more oriented towards the public interest, in a similar way that I've had to take a look at how we look at Aboriginal people and how we try and solve some of the problems we have in that field.
Thank you very much for this. It's been very interesting.
Thank you.
Bye for now.